Conservative Leader Pierre Polievre certainly takes a great deal of delight in talking about defunding CBC. It's something that gets the crowd going as well at his rallies across the country. There was a time when saying you would defund CBC would be something that would, make a lot of Canadians sit up and take notice, maybe make them angry. Nowadays, though, it's something that delights Conservatives while much of the rest of the country kind of shrugs their shoulders. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilley, your host, and today we're going to take a look at Canada's national broadcaster. Will it be defunded? Is it a good idea to defund it? And what would it look like if we tried to fix it instead of just scrapping it? Our guest on today's program is someone who knows all about CBC, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Richard Stursberg is a former broadcast executive. He was vice president of CBC Radio Canada from October 2004 until August 2010. He was in charge of English services, both the radio and TV side. He tried to bring about changes to CBC, but, as you'll hear in the conversation, it didn't always go so well. He's also the author of the 2012 memoir, The Tower of Babel, that spent a good deal of time talking about his time at CBC. Richard Stursberg joins us in Toronto today. Richard, thanks for the time.
My pleasure.
Before we get into the state of CBC and a certain apple-munching politician's views on it, I did want to ask you about, your time there, because you were hired for a specific purpose. You were hired to do what you'd done at Telefilm Canada, to go in and make shows that Canadians wanted to watch. You had some success. You had a lot of blowback. Before we get into the blowback and the internal pushback, tell me about the success. What was it like going into CBC with a mandate to make shows Canadians actually wanted to watch?
Well, the backdrop to it is that the CBC had been losing, CBC television is what I'm talking about now. CBC television had been losing market share, for the last 30 years. And its share had been consistently dropping. And the general view at the time, and certainly was my view, was that the CBC was paid for by all Canadians, so it should make things that were broadly popular. And it should make things that were Canadian, that neither CTV nor Global nor anybody else could really afford or, had the desire to make. And so there was, I think it's fair to say, a certain resistance, because there was a kind of theory within the CBC at the time that if you were to make popular shows, then inevitably they would be kind of stupid or of low quality. And that if you were to make clever shows, inevitably they would not be popular because the audience wouldn't get it. Now, I thought this was completely wrong-headed, and that the great challenge of television, like the great challenge of movies, is to make beautiful shows that are clever and popular, and that there's no inherent contradiction. So part of the difficulty was that there was this kind of culture within the CBC, and the culture was corrosive in the sense that, you could never win with a culture like that. If you made popular shows, it meant that you were stupid, and if you made shows that nobody watched, then you had a different problem. So part of the difficulty was to renovate the culture, and at the same time to change the entire strategy with respect to how we were making shows. So we started a process of making shows within the kinds of conventions that Canadians like in television, which are essentially American conventions. So Canadians like to see shows that were structured in particular kinds of ways, followed particular kinds of formats. We opened up, there was a huge, business that the CBC had ever wanted to touch in unscripted shows. And they were looked down upon, too, as kind of reality shows. And what came out of that was a series of new kinds of shows that the CBC had not really done before. So we did Little Mosque on the Prairie. We did things like Dragon's Den, which is on to this day. And we started building shows that were either, traditional procedurals or situation comedies or unscripted shows of one variety or another. And the response was interesting. The response was great. At a certain point, we had managed to position CBC television as the number 2 watched television service in prime time in the country after CTV, with all Canadian lineup, whereas CTV's lineup was, basically almost an all-American lineup.
Yeah, so they bid on the big popular shows out of the States. That's been their business model for years. So you're up against shows that are part of the wider zeitgeist. And you managed to say bypass global, which buys up the secondary shows out of the US.
And we were very successful. And so a number of interesting things happened as the CBC's shows got more popular. We would survey Canadians on a regular basis and see what they thought of the corporation in terms of, whether it mattered to them, whether they thought it was distinctive, and so on and so forth. And as the numbers got better, Canadians' attitudes towards the CBC became more and more positive. And the other thing that happened, which was fascinating to me, was that we also surveyed our own employees to find out what they thought of overall strategy. And not surprisingly, I think, as the shows got more popular, they became happier in terms of their work inside the corporation. So and I don't think that's altogether surprising. I mean, people like success. Nothing succeeds like success. And when they feel like they're working for a place that's successful and that's engaging, Canadians, then they feel better about their own work and they feel better about the place. So that's what it was.
I want to ask you about that antipathy, that idea that, popular is going to be bad. I mean, the most popular show for decades on CBC was Hockey Night in Canada. You don't get more base and more popular than just saying, here's a hockey game, guys, have at it.
Yep.
But people like it. And it was good quality broadcasting at the same time. So where did this idea come from that, no, we've just got to, make something for our friends in the deepest, darkest annex in downtown Toronto and to heck with everybody else?
I don't know, Brian. I mean, I think that I found it puzzling when I got there. I'd never really kind of seen that sort of a culture in any place I'd ever been before. So I don't really know how to account for it. But I do know that what happened was when we started to get successful, then, as I say, the culture itself began to shift and people began to say, oh, that's great. We can actually do this. And we can actually make these kinds of shows. And we're positive about the way in which the strategy is evolving.
I remember when your book, Tower of Babel, came out, interviewing you, and you told me a story about how you were touring the newsrooms and trying to tell them, don't be a stereotype. And then you got to one newsroom and they actually had the stereotype example that you were using leading off their newscast. Do you remember that?
I can't remember. What was the
I think it was about goat farmers.
Goat cheese.
Yeah, goat cheese.
They used to do things on goat cheese, and I said, I don't, that's really going to be gripping enough.
Leading off the 6:00 news with a story about your local organic goat cheese maker. It's a different mindset than what people were watching everywhere else.
And what people want to know, so the number one thing they want to know in terms of local news is issues that involve basically questions of security. And that's why people are interested in fires, they're interested in crime, they're interested in all these sort of questions as to how is their own community doing. So, we started to shift that around a bit. The other thing that was interesting for me, I don't know if you remember this or not, but this links a little bit back to the current criticisms, which is, people said, well, the problem with the news department is it's very left-leaning, it advantages the liberals, and it's full of communists. And so I myself want to know was the news, particularly the television news, was it fair? Was it balanced? And so we undertook a big study. We actually hired, a number of top experts, people, professors from UBC, York University, University of Washington, the Pew Center, and the University of Amsterdam to design a study that would look at the extent to which the news was in fact fair. And the way we did it was to compare our coverage of the Conservatives with our coverage of the Liberals against the baseline of how Global and CTV were covering them. And what we found, much to my complete amazement, was that the belief about the CBC News on the part of the Conservatives, and they were raising a lot of money on arguments that the CBC was hopelessly biased against them, was exactly the opposite. That we, in fact, gave more coverage to the Conservatives than did either Global or CTV, and that we treated them slightly more positively than we treated the Liberals.
Now, was this before or after the change in government? Because your time
this is during the Harper government. Okay. So we did this around 2008, and but the thing that really struck me was, so I thought, well, this is pretty interesting. People will be fascinated because the general view, I think, shared certainly within the Conservative Party, was that we were unfair to the Conservatives. So I thought, well, okay, fine. What we'll do is we're going to take all this research, we'll put it up all online, and I'll put all the data online. And if people want to reanalyze the data, they can do that themselves. And I'll make all the experts who actually designed the study and did the work available, if people want to talk to them and find out what really happened. So I thought this was going to be, an enormously interesting kind of news piece. And I became even a little bit worried that the Liberals would say that we were bending over backwards to be nice to Conservatives because of financing issues. But the weirdest thing that happened was nothing happened.
I don't even remember that story.
Yeah, absolutely nothing happened. Nothing happened. We put it up. We put it right on the very front of the website. We did a big press release around it. As I say, we put up all the data. We put up all the experts, and absolutely nothing happened. Nobody expressed any interest. Nobody called and said they wanted to get briefed. Nobody said they wanted to talk to the experts, et cetera, et cetera. It was completely amazing. But it went to one of the kind of mythological things, which is a lot of the talk, I think, and I think it's probably true today, a lot of the talk within the Conservative Party about the bias of the CBC is really talk that's designed to raise money from supporters of the Conservative Party, rather than talk that is based on, some actual, real, thoughtful evaluation of how the news is treating people.
The idea that there is a bias at CBC, though, that there is a downtown Toronto or Montreal bias, that's not something new. The oldest example I can find, I think it's from 1964. It's on CBC archives. And it's then CCF MP, Doug Fisher, who went on to become a great columnist for the Telegram and for the Telegraph and for the Sun. Mm-hmm. And he was elected for Thunder Bay. And he was up there with the NDP predecessor complaining about CBC in Ottawa. So CBC reporter went and interviewed him. And his comment was, it's Metropolitanism. They care about what happens in downtown Montreal and Toronto and Ottawa, and then there's the rest of the country. Is that fair?
Well, I think that it's interesting. I was very much of the view that's a different kind of bias, the Metropolitan bias, from the kind of political, and ideological bias that it was accused of. One of the things that's fascinating to me is that in terms of radio, if you have a local radio station covering, as we have in Toronto, for example, so you get Metro Morning in the morning, and then you get the afternoon drive show. So you have heavy coverage of local stuff. What happens is that the propensity of people in Toronto then to listen to the national radio shows goes up. And we saw that in every single market in the country. So that if there's a strong local presence, then people's enthusiasm for the national shows goes up as well. So one of the things that became important to me was actually to start rebuilding the local supper hour television shows. And for two reasons, one of which was that I thought that would also lift the national news in the same way as it did for radio. And secondly, Doug Fisher's right. It's very important to cover the country in its entirety. And suddenly that would have given us more local stories that we could play nationally and so on and so forth. So I think that's a fair point. The difficulty, of course, is that it's very expensive to do that. It's extremely expensive to do that. The French do it more effectively than the English, and that's in large measure because the French are much better financed than the English.
And so, smaller region for the majority of their audience.
Yeah, much smaller region, and they have, right now, I think the numbers are that the French services are financed at the level of about $70 per capita, and the English services are financed at about $23 per capita. And so, not surprisingly, they have better local presence because it's smaller and they have more money per capita.
Yeah, but I mean, look, part of my problem with, and that I have many problems with CBC, mm-hmm. But one of them is that, continually hearing, well, it's not financed properly enough and we don't have money for it. But then they go off and they have spent enormous amounts of money, basically turning their website into a newspaper to compete. They've spent a ton of money on a CBC streaming music service that for years you would go on it, and I would do this for my stories, and it would promote the latest pop music. And so they were essentially, competing for listeners for Elton John and Beyonce songs with Spotify, except CBC is free to the listener. They still have to pay for it. Free to the listener, whereas Spotify, you have to pay for it. Even on the local news, they've gone into markets that they never had a direct local presence, like Hamilton, and built up an online station competing with the private sector. So there's all this attempts to compete while in new ways, while not doing the core job, in my view.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that would it be desirable for CBC to get out of advertising? Yeah, I think it would. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One of which is that I think it's not wrong when people say that the CBC should not be competing with the private sector for advertising revenue, particularly given the sort of advertising markets now. But the other reason is, when it comes to television, more and more what we're seeing is that people have been trained to not watch ads. So whether you're PVRing your way through it or whether you're subscribing to streaming services, there are no ads. And when there are no ads, what it does is it opens up certain ways in which you can make television shows that are more creative, that are more interesting, and that are more imaginative. So I think that would be desirable. But again, it comes down to a problem of money. If I were to compare the amount of money that CBC gets from the government to, what the BBC gets, I mean, the BBC gets about 7 times as much money per capita. So they don't have to have ads. They don't have to look for other sources.
If you go on a BBC website in the UK, you don't get ads on the news story.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly right. But that's because it's much better financed by the British government than it has been historically than the CBC. I mean, they have, if I recall the numbers correctly, about 7 times as much money per capita that the CBC has.
So let's talk about this issue of defunding it. Do you think that Pierre Poilievre is saying this just to raise money, or do you think that he will look at defunding? I can't remember if his promise is all of English services or just English television. I think it might just be English television, but
English television. Yeah, that's what he was talking about.
Do you think he's doing this just to raise money, or is this a real possibility?
Well, I think he certainly is doing it to raise money. It's very funny. I'll tell you a story. So Doug Findlay, you recall Doug Findlay when he was the head of the Conservative Party's campaign director. A great character, yes. A great character, a fantastic character. Anyhow, after I'd left the CBC, it was a couple of years, 2 or 3 years later, the Senate, he was now a senator, and he'd asked, they were doing a look at the CBC and asked if I'd come down and talk about it. And I said, sure. And so he said hello to me, and he said, oh, I said, it's nice to see you. And he said, I read your book. He said, was terrific. And I said, oh, thank you. And I said, you're in it. Because you would spend all your time, writing letters to your supporters, telling them what a terrible group of people we were at the CBC and raise money. And he laughed and he said, that's exactly right. He said, that was my best money raising thing I could possibly say. Every time I attacked the CBC, money would pour in the door.
Well, what he would do is, without fail, he would release those fundraising letters to the media before they landed in anyone's mailbox so that he would get even more publicity out of it.
Even more publicity,
the entire gallery would write about it. It was, good politics.
It was, so, we had a laugh about that. But I mean, clearly that was working extremely well for the conservative base. And so I presume it's working well for the conservative base now. The problem, I'm sure that's partly just a fundraising thing, and it seems to work well in English Canada, and he knows it won't work well in French Canada, that it would be, in fact, a catastrophe if he were to say anything like that about French Canada. So, my guess is it's largely a fundraising thing. It's largely a way of animating the base more than anything else.
But would anyone notice if CBC television were defunded? I mean, the radio service is something different, and I think there's still some good parts on there. It's, I may pine for the days of Zosky, but that's a long time ago.
Yeah.
But the TV side, would anyone notice if they just lost their funding?
People will definitely notice. I mean, there'd be no doubt about that. Every time that you turn around and you say, well, maybe we should close a station in some small place that's not working well, then the level of screaming and carry on just is like, it goes on and on. So I'm sure that people would notice. Is it true that the numbers for English services have gone down in terms of the number of people watching? Yeah, the answer is yes. But again, I come back to the same thing. Like this, there's something very odd about what's going on right now. English television, and the numbers for CTV, the numbers for Global, the numbers of everybody have been going down. And partly that's because of the level of competition that, you have essentially these very large, very, very well-heeled, huge American services, whether it's Disney Plus or whether it's Amazon or whether it's Netflix, operating in Canada without really any obligations whatsoever with respect to Canadian television. So it's been very difficult, and the difficulty is compounded by the fact that the organization remains dramatically underfinanced.
But I mean, I think they are losing viewers, especially on the news side, because regardless of your study, a lot of people who don't live in the downtown areas, whether they vote conservative or not, just don't feel like it speaks to them anymore. And those who do vote conservative feels like it treats them with disdain. I mean, in the 2019 election, they sued the Conservative Party for doing the same thing other parties had done that they'd never sued. And they launched it, a week or so before. I don't know how you don't read into that there was a determined attempt to besmirch the Conservatives in that election campaign.
Well, this is way after my time.
Yeah.
And so I don't really have a view about that. But I would say that, I think that I agree that it's very, very important that the CBC not be patronizing, that the CBC be exactly the opposite of that it be an organization that speaks to all Canadians of whatever kind of ideological bent they happen to be, and that it speaks to them respectfully, without a doubt. But I come back to the thing, there's a kind of, big national cultural question that underpins all this, which really is, what do we want by way of a public broadcaster? If we don't want one, fine. Then wind it all up. Wind up the French side, wind up the whole thing. On the other hand, if you want one, if you think it's important that we have a great public broadcaster, as the British have the BBC, then you got to fund it properly. And you've got to make an arrangement whereby there's some kind of understanding between the government and the corporation as to what's going to happen. What they do with the BBC, which is very interesting, is every 10 years, they sit down and the government and the BBC essentially make an agreement as to what it is that the BBC is going to be about. And then they say, okay, how much is this going to cost? And then they agree on what the price is going to be, and then they strike the budget that way, and the budget is struck for 10 years. That's the so-called Royal Charter approach. The problem with the CBC right now is that there is no consensus, whether it's from the Conservatives or from the Liberals, as to what they want the CBC to be. Right? They say, oh, you should focus on, small towns. You should not focus on, big metropolitan areas. Well, if you start to wind up, Metro Morning in Toronto, people will be going crazy. But, so, is it a broadcaster of last resort? Is it supposed to do things that are, only the things that the private sector can't or won't do?
No.
Is it, there's no consensus. And at some point, you have to sort of say, well, if you really want one, let's have an agreement as to what it is that it's supposed to do, and let's finance it properly.
All right. Let's take a break here and talk about that, because there is, as you said, the wider issue beyond just CBC. The very survival of media in this country as a whole is up in the air. So we'll talk about that when we come back. Richard, while we're talking about the future of CBC, the fact is the whole media landscape is, falling apart. Let's be blunt. We're all wondering, can we survive? And if we can, then how? Nobody has a clear answer. Unless you're the Globe and Mail, where you just, find the richest family in the country that can lose money in perpetuity and still be wealthy.
Yeah.
Outside of that model, whether you're Post Media, Toronto Star, CTV, Global, go down to the United States. There was some thought, Jeff Bezos taking over the Washington Post would save it. Well, they've had trouble too. So we're trying to find a new way to go about it. So if you were structuring CBC now, and I've argued that we don't need a national public broadcaster, but you take the other view. And a lot of Canadians, especially on the radio side, have a very deep attachment. But what should they be doing then? Because, we talked earlier about the ads. There are all these services that compete with the private sector. How do we create a media environment where one organization getting $1 billion plus a year from the government isn't cannibalizing the private sector that still needs to exist and serve their markets as well?
Right.
How do we design that?
Well, I think it depends on the model that you want. Let's say, for example, just let me back this up for 1 second. As you may or may not know, I actually wrote a book. A lot of it was about this, called The Tangled Garden, which spent a lot of time looking at the collapse of news financing as a result of the loss of advertising revenue, which is what you're referring to. And what the book argued, is that it's fundamental to a democracy that we have strong and competing sources of news. We had a long look at Post Media. Post Media obviously is in gigantic financial trouble and has been in huge financial trouble for years. And so one of the things that the book argued is that what we should do is we should treat news, private sector news, in the same way as we would treat the production of television shows by the private sector. In other words, that what we would say, what we need to do is make sure that there are tax credits available. And the government went a small way towards doing this. So that, is it more important that we have news or that we have cooking shows? My answer would be, it's more important that we have news. So the government put in place some small tax credits. Now, in Quebec, the Quebec government has effectively doubled the value of those tax credits for news operations. And so now...
what do these tax credits go towards? Hiring people, or is this the subscription tax credit?
No, that's a smaller thing. This is the digital subscription tax credit. These are labor-based tax credits. And so the way they work is they simply take up a certain percentage of the costs of your labor. And the labor is defined as being the journalists, the editors, the people, photographers, the people who are actually putting the news together. My guess is that, that's going to be the sort of central way in which this is going to work. I mean, there are some enormous things at the New York Times that seems to be able to make enough money from subscriptions that they can survive and they can make money. I'm not sure that's going to be true in Canada.
Well, those fall off when Trump's not in the news.
Well, they do fall off.
That is, we all looked with hope towards what the New York Times was doing. And then as soon as they stopped bashing Donald Trump, rightly or wrongly, that's what the audience wanted. And they started to lose. We've all looked at these models and they're all leaving us perplexed.
Well, that's why I think that the better model to look at in Canada is a model where we say, okay, how is it that we finance television shows in this country? How is it that we finance movies? And we finance them largely with government subsidies of one variety or another. So, why we wouldn't say we'll put you on the same footing, the news on the same footing as we do cooking shows, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that would be a sensible thing to do.
Is there a way to do that where the public doesn't look and say, well, you're just in the pocket of the government now? Because I can tell you since the, was it 500 million over 4 years spread it around all the mostly print organizations, we get that thrown in our face all the time. How anyone believes I'm in Justin Trudeau's pocket is beyond me.
Exactly.
when you read my material, but that is still said to me. And by the way, I know people who are on the opposite side politically of me in their writings, and they get accused of being in the side of everyone's pocket, inside everyone's pocket as well. It's part of it, but there is a perception that the news isn't being fair because the government is subsidizing everyone.
Yeah, well, I mean, the truth of the matter is tax credits are automatic. The government has no say in whether you get the money or not. It's the same way as you would file a tax return. The tax department looks at it and says, that's fine, these are okay, off it goes. They're automatic. There's no subjectivity associated with saying, you're going to get this amount of money, but that person over there is not going to get this amount of money. So it's all nonsense. I mean, at a certain point, it's all nonsense. And even if you look at things like, just to come back to the CBC News study that we were talking about from 2008, people said, oh, well, because the government subsidizes the CBC's news, therefore it must be in the pocket of the government. And the answer was no, it's not. And it never has been. People can have perceptions for whatever they want, but when the perceptions are untrue, there's not very much you can do about it. Just say, except to say, that's not true. And here's how they actually work.
Well, I mean, and maybe it comes down to, is it a partisan bias or that metropolitan bias that we were talking about earlier? There was United Conservative Party held their big annual general meeting in Calgary over the weekend. And I happened to catch a big conversation on CBC about the very controversial parental rights agenda item that passed. And I thought, why do they keep saying that this is controversial? Every single poll from Leger, from Angus Reid, shows that vast majority of people support this. It's about 14% are on the other side and 78 or so are on the side of what the motion was about.
Right.
But every time CBC brings it up, they call it controversial. And we could go through a whole list of things where maybe it's on a cultural side or it's the metropolitanism. It's this view of, we'll explain what the world is like to you.
Right. Well, that's a slightly different point from the point about, whether people think that you're in the pockets of the government because you're taking tax credits. Mm-hmm. That's a different point altogether. And, I don't disagree with you that, like, for example, I'll give you an example from my own experience. The people had tended to be quite patronizing about evangelical Christians, and I would say, well, why are we being patronizing about evangelical Christians? The fact of the matter is, evangelical Christianity in places like Alberta had been fundamental in terms of the social and political environment of Alberta for many, many years, and continues to this day. I said, we can't adopt these kinds of attitudes. We have to treat everybody with respect, and we have to respect, what it is that they're doing. Now, if that's beginning to slip, then I think that's an unfortunate thing, and I think your general point would be right.
Yeah, it's and look, CBC is not the only media outlet that does this, and I'm sure you could find examples within Post Media as well. But you're the one that we all fund, or not you anymore, but me. CBC
not anymore. I mean, you can send me some money, Brian, if you'd like to. I'd look forward to that.
Yeah, just put the address in the chat here, and we'll have a check on the way.
Okay, good.
So, if you were advising any of the politicians on this issue, what would you say to each of them? To Jagmeet Singh, to Justin Trudeau, and especially to Pierre Poilievre as he's going to go into the next election, saying he'll defund the CBC. You know that some CBC journalists are going to take the bait and be very aggressive towards him, and then he'll say, "See, this is why we need to do it." So, what would you say to each of them? And then I'll ask you what you would advise CBC these days.
Well, I would say to each of them, look, the fundamental thing is, what do you want? Right now it's kind of riddled with contradictions. What do you want? Do you want a CBC that is going to be a CBC that doesn't compete for advertising dollars with the private sector? Do you want a CBC that is more focused on national, international, and investigative news as compared to local news? Do you want a CBC that's deeply local in character? Do you want a CBC that is actually a counterweight to all the American drama and comedy that it responds with? What do you want? Because it's, at the end of the day, what matters is, I may have a particular view about that, but what matters is that the government and the parties have a view on those issues. And then to be able to say, fine, this is what we believe the CBC should be. Or if you don't believe there should be a CBC, that's fine too. But then, don't just say we're going to get rid of English television. Get rid of a lot, right?
Well, as you say, that would be detrimental in
Quebec.
In Quebec.
People would go nuts. And, but I think that at the end of the day, my advice to them would be to say, if you want, we can talk through what the options are, and we can talk through what that would cost. Absolutely, we can do that. But at the end of the day, this is ultimately a political decision, and people have to have coherent views on it. And we haven't had a coherent view on what the future of the CBC should be from any of those parties for the last 50 years. We just haven't had one.
It's neither fish nor fowl.
No, that's what I mean. That's exactly what I mean.
And we say it's a counterweight to Americanism, and then we've got CBC's version of Family Feud. And there's nothing particularly Canadian about it, at least Battle of the Blades. We can all relate to it.
I love Battle of the Blades. That was my show.
It was your show, but it was also a popular one.
You know what we got for Battle of the Blades? This is an unimaginable number now. We were getting 3 million viewers a night.
Yeah.
And, it was bigger than a hockey night in Canada. And, it had become a kind of national sensation where everybody was talking about it. And everybody was wondering who was going to get eliminated and how it was going to work out. But I come back to it. I think it's at some point what needs to happen is there needs to be a coherent conversation about the future of the CBC, and it's not something that we've had. So I have a particular view, but my view is really neither here. My view has always been I thought it should be a big popular service. I thought if we can get out from under advertising, so much the better. What would it cost? It certainly will cost, if you want to do it properly, it would cost more than it costs now. We should, but that's just one view. That's just one view. And ultimately, it has to be a political decision. It has to be a decision that Canadians collectively take as part and parcel of, voting during an election.
What would be your advice to the folks at CBC headquarters to people like Catherine Tate, who has been rather aggressive towards Poilievre. I mean, look, he's been aggressive towards CBC, but she's been aggressive in a way that I don't recall. Maybe a few times Hubert Lacroix was upset with me, but you don't really see, CBC president lashing out. So, and I think, as I said, the journalists, many of them will take the bait. What would your advice be to them if you were having a nice little coffee clutch?
Oh, well, I think that these are two completely different things. The president of the CBC has a certain responsibility to defend the corporation. That's one thing. Journalists have a different responsibility, which is to report the news in a way that's fair and that's accurate, unless it's being identified as some form of, opinion piece. So I would say that as between the two, you would expect slightly different levels of conduct and slightly different preoccupations as to what their responsibilities are.
Richard, it's been a fascinating conversation, and I had not read your recent book on the media. I'll have to look that up.
The Tangled Garden. I recommend it to you, Brian. Actually, interestingly, the relatively conservative Donner Foundation shortlisted it for its prize. They give a prize every year for the best book on public policy written by a Canadian. And so it was shortlisted for a prize. The winner was somebody who wrote a book about pipelines, which I thought was less interesting, but there you go.
Well, you and I are media folks, and media folks like talking about media.
We do.
Thanks so much for the time, Richard.
Okay, I hope it's worth around.
Full Comment is a Post Media podcast. My name's Brian Lilley, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Proulx with theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. You can subscribe to Full Comment on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Listen through your app or Alexa-enabled devices and help us out. Give us a rating, leave a review, tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilley.